In the aftermath of war, silence can be more dangerous than the clash of armies. Beneath the ashes of fallen empires lie sealed corridors, locked doors, and pages torn from the record. Their ink bled into shadows. What if the greatest battles were never fought in the open, but in forgotten tunnels, sealed bunkers, and briefcases chained shut on midnight trains? There are whispers of archives deliberately erased, of weapons hidden not to be fired, but to remain as leverage, and of men whose names were wiped clean, yet whose influence stretched across borders. Imagine history not as a story told, but as a labyrinth designed to mislead, each turn leading you deeper into a maze of secrecy where truth itself becomes contraband. Here, alliances bend, morality dissolves, and the war never truly ends. It merely retreats underground, waiting for someone reckless enough to unearth it. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Files of Operation Sunrise. In the final months of the Second World War, as the Reich collapsed under relentless Allied pressure, a peculiar set of negotiations unfolded far from the bombed-out ruins of Berlin. It was late February 1945, and in the alpine town of Ascona, Switzerland, meetings began that would later be recorded under the codename Operation Sunrise. Officially, these were surrender talks, initiated by elements of the German High Command, who sought to spare northern Italy from the devastation that awaited the rest of the Reich. But the documents that survive, fragmented OSS cables, intercepted German transmissions, and the occasional diary entry of intelligence officers, paint a picture that is far more complicated and far more troubling. The OSS presence in Switzerland was headed by Allen Dulles, a man whose post-war career would rise to the pinnacle of the CIA. Dulles operated from a safe house in Bern, using the cover of diplomatic business while maintaining constant contact with German intermediaries. The chief negotiator on the German side was SS General Karl Wolff, head of the SS in Italy, a man with blood on his hands from deportations and massacres. The Americans should have treated him as a war criminal, but instead he was seated at tables, given assurances, and provided the language of trust. By March 1945, Wolff had agreed to negotiate, bringing with him promises of surrendering entire Wehrmacht divisions in northern Italy. The files that reference these sessions, however, are littered with redactions and coded terms that suggest Wolff's offers went beyond mere military capitulation. British intelligence, operating from London and Cairo, became suspicious almost immediately. Their intercept units in Bletchley Park picked up fragments of messages describing train convoys secured by SS escorts moving north through the Brenner Pass. These trains, loaded with crates marked only by inventory codes, were believed to contain not just gold and foreign currency looted from occupied Europe, but also stolen art from Florence, Milan, and Venice. When British officers demanded details of the negotiations, Dulles deflected, claiming the talks were preliminary and too sensitive to share. That secrecy ignited a fury inside Churchill's cabinet, who feared the Americans were already positioning themselves for the post-war order while shielding useful Nazi officials from justice. Later, fragments of Swiss customs reports surfaced, mentioning sealed convoys crossing into neutral territory under the escort of German-speaking civilians. The reports note the presence of diplomatic plates, hastily issued by American personnel in Zurich. A declassified OSS memo from April 1945, filed under reference XG97, records priority cargo transfers authorized by upper command. The memo does not specify the contents, but lists destinations: Lisbon, Buenos Aires, and Cairo. These were not places where frontline capitulations were taking place. They were instead hubs of intelligence networks, safe havens, and financial corridors for post-war escape routes. By April 29, 1945, the formal surrender of German forces in Italy was signed at Caserta, with Wolff among the signatories. Publicly, the Allies declared this a triumph of diplomacy, a saving of lives. Yet, when Allied occupation troops finally scoured northern Italy, they encountered empty vaults, stripped archives, and missing SS personnel. The so-called Sunrise files contained references to special protection clauses for unnamed individuals. Italian investigators in the 1950s later argued that these clauses shielded Wolff and several of his adjutants from prosecution, despite overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Wolff would later testify at Nuremberg, but his sentence was light, and he was quietly released in 1969, living out his days in West Germany with surprising freedom. American records remain suspiciously incomplete. In 1967, a set of microfilms surfaced in a private collection in Geneva, labeled personal property of OSS Bern. These reels included copies of communications between Dulles and Washington in March 1945. One message, heavily censored when released under FOIA decades later, references strategic retention of assets and provisional immunity for select German personnel. Scholars who examined the fragments argued that this was the blueprint for what would become the CIA's policy of absorbing former enemy operatives into its Cold War structure. Some of these men had skills in intelligence gathering, logistics, or covert operations that were deemed too valuable to waste in trials. The Soviets, learning of Sunrise through their own channels, were furious. Stalin sent cables directly to Roosevelt, accusing the Americans of betrayal and of seeking a separate peace. For the Kremlin, Operation Sunrise was not a humanitarian effort, but the first proof of Anglo-American duplicity, planting seeds of mistrust that would harden into the Cold War divide. Soviet propaganda amplified the story, though without full access to the details. To this day, Russian archives hold files that Western scholars have never seen, believed to contain decrypted OSS messages and intercepted conversations between Wolf and Swiss intermediaries. The Soviet assessment concluded that the Americans used Sunrise to exfiltrate intelligence officers and scientific experts before the Red Army could capture them. The Italian connection also lingers. Post-war police reports in Milan and Turin describe caches of German weapons discovered in rural barns and mountain tunnels. Several were guarded by Italian fascists who claimed they had been told to await further orders, even after surrender. Some of these stockpiles bore markings consistent with Sunrise convoys. Declassified Italian parliamentary inquiries from the 1970s suggested a link between these wartime caches and the later stay-behind networks that plagued Italy during the Cold War under the NATO umbrella. If true, it would mean that Sunrise was not simply an end-of-war negotiation, but the foundation of clandestine structures that endured for decades. Perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence lies in the testimonies of displaced persons. Survivors of Dachau and Mauthausen recalled seeing SS officers vanish from camps in March 1945, their names never appearing on prisoner lists or war crime tribunals. Some of these officers were reportedly seen in northern Italy, traveling with Wolf's entourage. One Yugoslav witness even claimed to have seen a known camp doctor boarding a train in Bolzano under American escort. His statement, filed with the UN War Crimes Commission, was later buried in an annex labeled unsubstantiated. To this day, the National Archives in Washington contains only a handful of files labeled Operation Sunrise, many of them incomplete, riddled with missing pages, or carrying red stamps of classified beyond 2045. The story told to the public is one of pragmatic diplomacy, a deal that shortened the war and spared civilian lives. But the shadows in the documents tell another version of secret transfers, of bargains struck with men who should never have walked free, and of stolen assets that never resurfaced. Every new scrap that emerges deepens the suspicion that Operation Sunrise was less about surrender than about the preservation of power, the quiet establishment of new alliances, and the protection of intelligence assets that would form the skeleton of the coming Cold War. When the last sealed files are opened, if they ever are, they may not reveal a humanitarian victory, but rather the first act of a new kind of war. A war fought not with divisions and tanks, but with secrets, silence, and shadows. For those who search the archives, Sunrise remains less a peace negotiation than a doorway into a darker continuity, where surrender was never unconditional, and where the lines between victor and vanquished were deliberately blurred. Chapter 2: Ghost Convoys of the Baltic Sea. In the aftermath of the German collapse in May 1945, the Baltic Sea should have been quiet, its waters patrolled only by victorious Allied navies and exhausted fishing fleets. Yet, beginning that summer, a strange series of sightings unsettled Soviet naval intelligence. Reports filtered into Leningrad from coastal lookouts near Liepaja and Gdynia, U-boat silhouettes cruising at night, their profiles unmistakably German. Soviet radar stations logged faint signals, but when destroyers gave chase, the contacts disappeared into the deep channels of the Baltic or slipped into fog banks near Bornholm. For years, these were dismissed as misidentifications, But within Soviet archives lies evidence that suggests something far stranger, a series of operations codenamed Project Trident, tasked with tracking what Moscow believed to be ghost convoys of the Kriegsmarine that had somehow survived surrender. The first recorded case appears in an NKVD report dated July 1945, written by Major Vasily Korotkov of the 4th Naval Directorate. He detailed an encounter off the coast of Gdansk, in which Soviet sonar picked up 3 vessels moving in tight formation at depths consistent with Type 21 U-boats. The Kriegsmarine had only launched a handful of these advanced submarines, most of them scuttled or captured. Yet here was a cluster moving with precision, ignoring all challenges and fading into the seabed canyons north of Hel Peninsula. The destroyer Storozhevoy pursued for 6 hours but found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, not even a torpedo wake. The Soviet report was filed under anomalous, but in the margins a note was scrawled: possible enemy survival. By 1946, the sightings had multiplied. Polish dock workers in Gdynia described unloading crates from unmarked ships at night, overseen by men who spoke German but wore no insignia. One worker, interrogated years later, recalled wooden boxes stamped only with stenciled letters WWII and R12. These markings were later matched to internal Kriegsmarine codes for experimental weapons research. Meanwhile, Swedish naval patrols reported unidentified vessels surfacing near Karlskrona, sometimes flashing false signals in Morse code, pretending to be Allied craft. A classified Swedish Navy memo from August 1946 described an encounter with what they believed to be a disguised German minesweeper, stripped of markings, carrying strange antenna arrays. When challenged, the ship doused its lights and vanished into heavy fog. Western intelligence also noticed. Declassified British Admiralty cables from 1947 reference phantom flotillas in the Baltic, including a disturbing report from HMS Bergenay, a minesweeper that detected sonar pings consistent with submarine wolfpack tactics. They moved as though trained together, the report states, but no German Navy exists to train them. American intelligence analysts speculated that these were remnants of the Kriegsmarine attempting to flee Soviet occupation, carrying scientists, archives, or technology toward neutral havens. But no official statement was ever made, and the files were buried until fragments resurfaced decades later under FOIA requests. The Soviet Union responded with brute force. In early 1947, Marshal Zhukov authorized Operation Neptune Sweep, deploying more than a dozen destroyers and patrol aircraft to scour the Baltic for remnants of the German fleet. The search produced wrecks, yes, but mostly abandoned freighters, burned-out trawlers, and a handful of scuttled U-boats deliberately sunk by their own crews. What they did not find were the advanced submarines hinted at in the reports. Yet Soviet technical officers noted something chilling. Several recovered wrecks showed signs of sabotage from within, as if crews had destroyed logbooks, instruments and engines to prevent capture. One vessel had its radio compartment stripped bare, down to the mounting brackets. The official Soviet conclusion was that they were dealing with highly disciplined remnants of the Nazi Navy, executing a deliberate withdrawal. Whispers of the ghost convoys crossed into conspiracy in 1948, when an Estonian fisherman reported seeing a surface submarine near Saaremaa Island. He claimed it was guarded by armed men on deck, who shouted at him in German before forcing him to leave. When he returned days later with Soviet authorities, the beach where the sub had been moored bore the tracks of crates dragged into the forest. A search uncovered nothing, but locals whispered for years of strange activity in the woods, lights at night, and foreign-speaking strangers. The NKVD filed it away as panic induced by smuggling, but several senior officers treated the testimony as authentic. By 1949, rumors reached the West German press. A Hamburg newspaper ran a story about Die letzte Flotte, suggesting remnants of the Kriegsmarine had formed a shadow fleet, ferrying stolen treasures and classified research across the Baltic. Official Allied responses mocked the idea, dismissing it as fantasy. Yet within NATO's restricted archives, reports continued to circulate. An American intelligence brief from 1951 warned that unexplained naval activity persists in the Baltic, possibly involving Soviet deception operations. The irony was that the Soviets were issuing almost identical memos about Western trickery. The most chilling evidence came from intercepted radio traffic. Soviet cryptanalysts in Riga logged bursts of high-frequency signals in 1946 and 1947, each lasting only seconds, but carrying what appeared to be encrypted Morse. Attempts to break the cipher failed. Years later, analysts compared the format to late-war German Enigma patterns, suggesting that someone somewhere was still using equipment thought destroyed in May 1945. A small fragment, decrypted in 1962, contained coordinates pointing toward the Skagerrak Strait, the deep water channel between Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. No Allied or Soviet fleets were scheduled there at the time. The ghost convoys eventually faded from reports by the early 1950s, but the legend persisted. Swedish divers in the 1970s discovered a wreck off Gotland containing crates of vacuum tubes, blueprints, and mechanical rotors bearing markings of the Reichspostministerium's cipher bureau. These were not typical cargo. Historians speculated the wreck was part of a desperate attempt to move cryptographic material before Soviet forces captured it. Yet if one submarine was lost, how many others succeeded? Even in the 1990s, after Soviet archives opened briefly, researchers found references to Project Trident as late as 1954, long after the war had ended. The files remain fragmentary, heavily censored, but they confirm that both Moscow and Washington tracked rumors of surviving German naval units well into the Cold War. What began as reports of phantom vessels may have been remnants of a deliberate exfiltration, men, machines, and secrets spirited out of Europe under cover of night, hidden in the very sea that was supposed to be under Allied control. For decades, sailors in the Baltic spoke quietly of seeing strange shadows under the waves, or of radar echoes that appeared and disappeared in impossible ways. Officially, there was nothing to see, just faulty instruments, nervous eyes, or Soviet disinformation. Yet the files, the testimonies, and the wrecks that still turn up along the seabed tell another story. The war, it seems, did not simply end in 1945. In the cold, grey waters of the Baltic, fragments of it lingered, moving silently, hidden from history, carrying with them the last secrets of a navy that refused to surrender to time. Chapter 3. Operation Paperclip's Missing Scientists. When Germany fell in May 1945, the Allied powers scrambled not only for territory but for minds. Scientists, engineers, and medical researchers who had served the Reich became prizes in the shadow war that followed. The United States launched Operation Paperclip, a program that quietly transported hundreds of former Nazi specialists to America. Officially, 1,600 individuals were recruited, their pasts whitewashed for the sake of technological advantage. But within the surviving files is a silence louder than the names recorded. Entire clusters of men and women who appeared on preliminary lists, only to vanish without trace. These are the missing scientists of Paperclip. Erased from both American and Soviet archives, their fates whispered about only in classified annexes. The story begins with captured German personnel rosters at Peenemünde, the site of the V-2 rocket program. Early OSS reports from June 1945 listed more than 300 individuals considered high value, yet only half of these names reappear in the official Paperclip manifests. Among the missing were medical researchers attached to Dachau's aviation experiments, cryptographers who worked at cipher stations in Dresden, and engineers specializing in nerve agents like tabun and sarin. Their disappearance was first noticed in British intelligence summaries, which noted a disturbing inconsistency between the number of scientists earmarked for transfer and those actually accounted for in American custody. A cable from the Foreign Office to Washington in September 1945 demanded clarification, but no reply was ever logged. Hints of a parallel operation appear in flight logs from Lisbon and Madrid. These neutral hubs became transit points for covert transfers, often using civilian aircraft chartered under Red Cross or diplomatic covers. An Air Transport Command manifest from November 1945 shows a group of technical consultants bound for Buenos Aires, though their names were redacted when the document was declassified decades later. Argentine immigration records from the same period describe arrivals of German nationals with professional backgrounds listed as engineer or doctor, but with no further details. Some of these individuals later surfaced in South America's growing German enclaves, though whether they were fugitives, assets, or both remains unclear. The US government's own files betray the absence. Declassified CIA records include references to restricted transfers categorized under designations such as RT-17 and RT-32. These referred to personnel whose Identities were deliberately concealed from public-facing paperclip records. One OSS memorandum, dated December 1945, chillingly noted, RT-32 group successfully delivered, advised not to publicize. Historians believe these were specialists in biological and chemical warfare, men whose work could not be explained away without igniting scandal. Their expertise was too valuable to discard, but their crimes too monstrous to acknowledge, and so they were disappeared into the folds of intelligence bureaucracy. Evidence of their survival surfaces indirectly. In 1947, a secret US Army report on human tolerance to extreme altitudes contained data eerily similar to experiments conducted in Dachau. The document carried no author's name, only the stamp of the Aeromedical Center at Randolph Field, Texas. In Argentina, the 1950s saw the quiet establishment of laboratories in remote provinces, funded through shadow corporations. Investigative journalists later uncovered supply contracts linked to former German businesses. A 1963 West German parliamentary inquiry concluded that at least 94 scientists originally listed for Paperclip never arrived in the United States, but their trail could not be followed because both Washington and Bonn claimed ignorance. The Soviet Union, too, noticed the gaps. In an internal NKVD report from 1946, Colonel Ivan Serov accused the Americans of deliberately misreporting the number of captured scientists. He cited intercepted correspondence mentioning additional transfers via Lisbon and warned Stalin that the United States was stockpiling knowledge in secret. Ironically, the Soviets had their own equivalent program, Operation Osoaviakim, in which they forcibly relocated more than 2,000 German specialists to the USSR. Yet even they could not account for the missing paperclip names. The KGB files released in the 1990s contain annotations such as disappeared in transit or possibly in South America. These cryptic remarks suggest that both superpowers were aware of a third pipeline, an underground network smuggling expertise into places beyond their immediate reach. Of the most enigmatic figures was Dr. Heinrich Müller, not to be confused with the Gestapo chief of the same name. This Müller, a biologist specializing in vector-borne diseases, appears in OSS personnel notes as recommended for technical interrogation. Yet after August 1945, his name disappears. In 1949, a US Army medical report on tropical disease countermeasures included passages nearly identical to Müller's pre-war papers. Researchers suspect that he was absorbed into a covert laboratory project, perhaps in Panama or Puerto Rico, where the US Army conducted mosquito vector studies. If true, his inclusion was deliberately obscured from public paperclip rosters. Another case involves a cryptographer named Friedrich Bauer, who worked on advanced rotor systems for the German Navy. He was listed for transfer in July 1945, but never appears in official US or Soviet custody records. Yet in 1952, NATO Communications Security Manuals introduced cipher principles identical to Bauer's unpublished designs. His family later claimed he had died in Soviet captivity, but no grave or documentation exists. Was he buried in silence, or did he live on, nameless within an Allied cryptographic bureau? The moral dimension of these erasures is impossible to ignore. By shielding names, the Allies allowed war criminals to escape accountability. In 1987, the US Department of Justice investigated suspected Nazi affiliations of paperclip scientists, but admitted that key files had been destroyed or misplaced. Congressional inquiries in the 1990s confirmed that at least 15 individuals connected to concentration camp experiments had been granted entry into the United States under falsified identities. Yet the number of missing names suggests the scope was far greater. Entire categories of expertise, biological weapons, cryptography, interrogation techniques, vanished into the abyss, shielded by classification. The most enduring mystery is where these men ultimately ended up. Some likely lived out their lives in anonymity, hidden within military laboratories in the American Midwest or Soviet research institutes in Siberia. Others may have slipped into Latin America, where authoritarian regimes welcomed foreign expertise. A handful may even have been eliminated, their usefulness spent, their identities inconvenient. What is certain is that they did not vanish by accident. Their erasure was deliberate, systematic, and executed at the highest levels of both American and British intelligence. Today, historians working with fragments of declassified files struggle to reconstruct the missing roster. Patterns emerge in the redactions. A name absent here, a code number obscured there, destinations marked only with cryptic initials. Each piece suggests a program far larger and darker than the sanitized version told to the public. Operation Paperclip was not merely a scientific recruitment drive. It was a cover for selective exfiltration, where certain individuals were hidden not only from justice but from history itself. The missing scientists remain a wound in the archival record, their fates unresolved, their knowledge perhaps still echoing in classified projects. They are the shadows of Paperclip, men erased from manifests, yet whose fingerprints linger in the technologies and tactics of the Cold War. To this day, their absence feels deliberate, as if entire chapters of history were torn from the record, leaving only silence where accountability should have been. And in that silence lies the chilling suggestion that some truths were never meant to be uncovered, buried not in graves, but in the vaults of intelligence services that chose secrecy over justice. Chapter 4. The Vault Beneath Wewelsburg Castle. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces surged across Germany, few sites held as much symbolic weight for the collapsing Third Reich as Wewelsburg Castle. Situated in Westphalia, this fortress had been personally chosen by Heinrich Himmler to serve as the ideological and ceremonial heart of the SS. While Allied propaganda focused on the castle's occult trappings, ritual chambers, runic insignias, and the so-called Black Sun mosaic, less attention was given to the persistent rumors of a secure subterranean vault. The official narrative states that when the US 3rd Armored Division captured the castle in April 1945, it was largely stripped and abandoned. Yet scattered testimonies and classified documents hint that something far more valuable lay beneath its stone walls, sealed off and hidden from the historical record. According to declassified after-action reports from the 3rd Armored Division, American troops discovered reinforced steel blast doors in the lower levels of the North Tower. Engineers attempted to breach them but were ordered to stop when higher command intervened. Within days, the castle was transferred to British control. War diaries from the British Second Army reference a Category X transfer conducted at the site, though no specifics were recorded. Later, under the Official Secrets Act, nearly every reference to the operation was redacted or destroyed. This silence has only fueled speculation about what was found and why the Allies chose to conceal it. Testimony from captured SS officers provides further fragments. In an interrogation dated May 1945, an adjutant to Himmler mentioned secured chambers containing documents, equipment, and prototypes. Another SS man, interrogated in Nuremberg, described the vault as containing special files concerning foreign intelligence and technical matters. While some dismissed these accounts as attempts at bargaining for leniency, the consistency of the descriptions is striking. Even more telling is the fact that Allied intelligence officers routinely flagged these testimonies as sensitive, do not circulate. In the decades since, researchers have pieced together circumstantial evidence pointing to a cache of advanced technology stored at Wewelsburg. German records show that SS research units, particularly the Ahnenerbe, had connections not only to pseudoscientific and archaeological pursuits, but also to practical military projects. One 1944 Reich Ministry memorandum linked the castle to radar countermeasure research and experimental propulsion systems. British scientific intelligence files from 1945 contain references to sensitive recoveries in Westphalia that were forwarded to laboratories in Farnborough. What exactly was retrieved remains classified, but contemporaneous notes suggest it was technical in nature, highly advanced, not to be disclosed. The secrecy was not limited to the Anglo-American side. Soviet intelligence, through its occupation, authorities in Thuringia and Saxony, attempted to gather information about the castle and its rumoured vault. A 1946 GRU field report claimed that US forces had removed several truckloads of sealed containers before the British took possession. Soviet analysts speculated that these containers included cryptographic material, experimental jet designs, or even files documenting SS covert operations across Europe. Stalin himself reportedly asked his intelligence chiefs for updates on Wewelsburg, indicating that the site held symbolic and practical significance. Local accounts from villagers around Wewelsburg further muddy the waters. Several reported seeing convoys of American trucks leaving the castle grounds at night during the week of its capture. Others recalled explosions as German forces attempted to demolish parts of the structure before retreating. Yet the specific area containing the vault survived intact, sealed off by Allied engineers. In the 1950s, when British authorities considered converting the castle into a youth hostel, construction workers were warned away from exploring the lower levels. Access to the vault area remained restricted until at least the 1960s, when documentation abruptly ceases. There is also evidence that the vault contained intelligence on SS financial networks. Declassified US Treasury files from the late 1940s mention documents of banking significance seized in Westphalia. These may have included records of accounts used to launder looted gold and art through neutral countries such as Switzerland and Portugal. If true, this could explain the reluctance to disclose the contents. Exposing such material might have implicated not only the SS, but also financial institutions in neutral states that continued to operate after the war. Occasional leaks have kept the mystery alive. In 1998, a German journalist uncovered fragments of a British intelligence file referencing items recovered from Wewelsburg Castle, subsequently transferred to special operations. The document, though incomplete, listed categories such as PSYOPs material, cryptographic systems, and aeronautical prototypes. Around the same time, a retired US Army engineer claimed in an interview that he had been involved in transporting large metal cases from Wewelsburg to an airfield near Kassel. He described the containers as unusually heavy and guarded under extraordinary security. His testimony was dismissed by officials, but it echoes earlier accounts. The physical structure of the castle itself supports the theory of a hidden vault. Architectural plans recovered after the war show reinforced underground chambers constructed between 1939 and 1943, funded directly by Himmler's SS budget. These were no mere ceremonial halls. They included blast-proof doors, ventilation systems, and reinforced concrete walls. The design was consistent with secure archives or storage facilities, not with ritual chambers. Yet in official post-war surveys, these sections were omitted or glossed over, as though they had been erased from the record. Some historians suggest the vault may have contained evidence of war crimes beyond the battlefield. The SS was notorious for destroying incriminating records, but Wewelsburg may have served as a central archive for files deemed too sensitive to risk in Berlin. If these documents detailed human experimentation, covert operations in neutral states, or the management of concentration camp labor, then their disappearance into Allied custody could explain why so little paper evidence survived for post-war trials. The convenient absence of certain categories of documentation at Nuremberg has long troubled researchers. What is undeniable is that the mystery of the vault beneath Wewelsburg remains unresolved. Despite the passage of time, requests under Germany's archival laws have produced only heavily censored files. British and American agencies continue to withhold the most relevant documents, citing national security even 70 years later. Such persistent secrecy suggests that the vault's contents were not only real, but continue to have implications today. Whether in intelligence methods, political embarrassments, or technologies that were quietly folded into post-war programs. Standing in the present, the castle itself has been repurposed as a museum and memorial, its dark SS history acknowledged but sanitized. Visitors can see the ceremonial hall, the black sun mosaic, and the surviving architecture. What they cannot see are the sealed doors beneath the North Tower, long welded shut and forgotten by all but a few archivists and intelligence officers. The silence surrounding them is perhaps the loudest testimony of all. For those who sift through the fragments of intercepted cables, interrogation notes, and declassified war diaries, one conclusion seems unavoidable. Something of great significance was hidden beneath Wewelsburg Castle. Whether it was advanced technology, incriminating financial records, or evidence of covert projects, it was deemed too dangerous to ever reveal. The vault's true contents remain locked away not only in steel and stone, but in the deliberate erasure of the historical record. And as long as the files stay sealed, Wewelsburg will stand as a monument not only to the ideology of the SS, but to the secrets of a war whose full story has yet to be told. Chapter 5. Operation Gladio and the Silent Armories. As Europe emerged from the ruins of the Second World War, the continent quickly became the front line of a new conflict. The Cold War was not just a geopolitical struggle of superpowers, but also a war fought in shadows, with weapons hidden not on the battlefield, but beneath the soil of ordinary towns and villages. In this tense atmosphere, NATO initiated a clandestine network known by its Italian codename Operation Gladio. Officially described as a stay-behind program, Gladio's purpose was to prepare resistance networks in case of a Soviet invasion. Yet as investigations decades later would uncover, these secret armories and their handlers often blurred the line between defense and manipulation, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, political violence, and suppressed files. The origins of Gladio trace back to 1948, when CIA and MI6 officers, working with Italian intelligence, drafted plans to establish covert caches of arms across Western Europe. These hidden stockpiles, buried in forests, caves, and abandoned farmhouses, contained submachine guns, plastic explosives, radios, and forged documents. A declassified CIA cable from 1949 outlined the strategy. Establish compartmentalized cells with local contacts. Provide secure arms depots. Train for sabotage and communications. Each cell was to remain dormant until activated by invasion. But in practice, the very existence of these networks made them attractive tools for domestic influence far beyond their stated purpose. In Italy, the program gained its most infamous reputation. Parliamentary inquiries in the 1990s revealed that dozens of secret bunkers had been discovered, often linked to right-wing paramilitaries. One such cache, unearthed near Verona in 1972, contained Sterling submachine guns marked with US Army property stamps, along with detonators and encrypted radios. Police reports noted that the weapons were in pristine condition, wrapped in oiled paper and clearly maintained. When questioned, Italian military officials admitted that these caches were part of NATO's secret preparations, but denied any misuse. Yet the timing was suspicious. The discovery coincided with a series of bombings attributed to neo-fascist groups, raising the possibility that Gladio arms were being diverted into domestic terrorism. Belgium and Greece presented similar patterns. In Brussels, an unmarked warehouse fire in 1984 exposed crates of ammunition traced back to NATO supply lines. In Athens, the trial of right-wing extremists revealed connections to weapons traced to Gladio depots. A Greek parliamentary investigation concluded that stay-behind structures were penetrated by extremist networks, but stopped short of assigning official culpability. The pattern repeated across Europe. Whenever arms surfaced in political violence, governments invoked secrecy laws, shutting down inquiries. The secrecy, rather than the facts, became the defining feature of Gladio. Documents later declassified show that Gladio was not merely about caches, but about people. Recruitment focused on anti-communist veterans, often from far-right or nationalist backgrounds. Training camps were held in remote parts of Sardinia, Bavaria, and the Black Forest. A CIA training manual from 1951 describes exercises in sabotage, coded communications, and demolition techniques. These manuals carried warnings that the program's existence must remain compartmentalized even from elected officials. Indeed, in most cases, national parliaments were unaware of Gladio until decades later. This deliberate secrecy meant that accountability was nearly impossible, and misuse, if it occurred, could always be denied. The most explosive revelations came from Italy in the aftermath of the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, which killed 85 people. Prosecutors investigating the attack discovered connections between the perpetrators, neo-fascist militants, and individuals with documented ties to stay-behind structures. While direct proof of NATO involvement was never produced, the circumstantial evidence raised chilling questions. In 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti confirmed the existence of Gladio to Parliament, describing it as a NATO-directed program with secret arms caches. He insisted it had never been used for domestic operations, but his testimony ignited outrage across Europe, leading to inquiries in Belgium, France, and Germany. Declassified NATO minutes show the alliance was acutely aware of the political damage. A 1968 memorandum from the Allied Clandestine Committee, the secret body coordinating Gladio, noted the risk of compromise through domestic misuse. Yet no corrective action appears to have been taken. Instead, the networks persisted, fueled by Cold War paranoia and the belief that secrecy itself was security. When caches were exposed, explanations range from training reserves to unauthorized storage, but the consistency of their presence across multiple countries undermined these defenses. One of the most troubling aspects of Gladio was its overlap with intelligence operations targeting political groups. In Italy, arms depots were sometimes placed near industrial centres with strong communist unions, suggesting that the weapons might be intended not for foreign invaders, but for domestic uprisings. In Turkey, stay-behind structures became entangled with the so-called counter-guerrilla, a shadow force implicated in political assassinations and street violence during the 1970s. Parliamentary testimony from former Turkish officers confirmed that Gladio-trained personnel were used against leftist organizations, blurring the line between preparation and repression. Even after its exposure, the full scope of Gladio has never been disclosed. Requests under Freedom of Information laws in the United States and United Kingdom have produced heavily redacted documents, often citing national security, even decades after the Cold War's end. In Italy, investigators complained that key files were destroyed or misplaced in the 1970s. A few documents that survived paint a stark picture: maps of hidden depots, lists of codenames for cell leaders, and inventories of explosives sufficient to arm battalions. Yet no government has ever provided a complete accounting of the network. The legacy of Gladio is not only the buried weapons but the mistrust it fostered. For many Europeans, the revelations confirmed suspicions that their democracies had been manipulated from within, their political landscapes shaped by forces beyond their control. While NATO insists the program was defensive, the lack of transparency leaves open the possibility that Gladio's silent armories were more than just contingency plans. They were instruments of influence, wielded in secret and without oversight. Today, remnants of those armories still surface. Hikers in the Italian Alps occasionally stumble upon rusting ammunition boxes. Divers off the coast of Greece have retrieved sealed containers believed to be part of maritime caches. Each discovery raises the same question: how much was hidden and how much remains? More importantly, how many of those weapons were used not against a Soviet enemy that never came, but against citizens in the fragile democracies of post-war Europe? Operation Gladio stands as one of the most unsettling legacies of the Cold War. Not because of what it was meant to be, a defense against invasion, but because of what it became: a silent, unacknowledged armory scattered across a continent, waiting for orders that were never supposed to come. Its existence reminds us that wars do not always end when the treaties are signed. Sometimes they continue underground, in locked bunkers, hidden files, and in the silence of governments that choose secrecy over truth. And as long as the archives remain sealed, the full story of Gladio will remain untold, its weapons buried not only in soil, but in history itself. And when the dust settles, what remains are not victories or defeats, but questions. Questions etched into sealed envelopes, stamped, classified, and buried in vaults meant never to be opened. Every uncovered scrap suggests a larger design, a chain of hidden bargains and unspeakable truths dangling just beyond reach. Perhaps the darkest secrets of conflict are not the weapons forged or the battles lost, but the silences crafted with precision. Silence that shapes the world more than any gunshot. For in the shadows where memory falters and records end, history lingers like smoke, refusing to vanish and daring us to follow it into the void where answers were never meant to be found.